Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Ryan Streeter. I'm the Director of Domestic Policy Studies here, and I'm glad to welcome you and those watching online to this session, Why Spatial Reasoning Matters for Educational Policy. I think the research that our two scholars have been conducting in this area is really interesting. I think the implications are wide-ranging and important, and so we'll look forward to hearing from them and then also taking some time to have a conversation with them. Joining us today are Jonathan Wai. He's an assistant professor of education policy and psychology at the University of Arkansas, where he's the 21st Century Endowed Chair in Education Policy. He holds a PhD from Vanderbilt University. Joining him is David Uttal from Northwestern University, where he's a professor in the Department of Psychology, where he also runs a research lab and focuses on symbolic representation, informal learning, and spatial thinking. And he holds his PhD from the University of Michigan. So what I'm going to do is hand the floor over to them so that they can walk you through their presentation, and then we'll take some time to go a little bit deeper in some of these topics just through a time of conversation and Q&A. So please do join me in welcoming our guests today. John, are you first? Okay, yeah, come on up to just watch your step here.
Okay, so do we have the presentation up or? Oh, click the button. Yeah, all right, I'll push this button. Okay, so I'm Jonathan Wai, and today my colleague David Uttal and I will be talking to you about the importance of spatial reasoning in education and research and policy. And the main thrust of our argument is essentially that we need to include spatial reasoning throughout education because it can help a very large population of students. So first question is, what is spatial reasoning? According to the scholar David Lohman, it's the ability to generate, retain, retrieve, and transform well-structured visual images. Spatial reasoning can be measured through reliable and valid paper and pencil tests. Here's an example of some work I did with David Lubinsky and Camilla Benbow of Vanderbilt University, and just gives you an idea of different items. For example, on the bottom, there's an abstract reasoning item where we have to fill in the missing shape. Above that is a mechanical reasoning item where, for example, if you turn one gear in the system, what happens to the other gears in the system? And other items, for example, rotating in two-dimensional space, and then also three-dimensional cardboard cutouts. If you put it all together, what kind of three-dimensional shape would that be? Spatial reasoning is also reasoning, mental representation, and transformation of information about locations in space, and also relations among those locations. There we go. What are examples of people high in spatial reasoning? Well, there's this guy. He's Albert Einstein. He famously imagined chasing after a light beam. This Gnoccan experiment led to his first published paper at age 16 titled The Investigation of the State of Aether and Magnetic Fields, and eventually to the creation of the theory of relativity. Other examples would be engineers, a lot of mechanical engineers. For example, this is the Falcon Heavy rocket made by SpaceX. Why is spatial reasoning important? It's also important for navigation in STEM learning and reasoning. For example, spatial reasoning was used to fully visualize the structure of benzene. And for biology, Watson and Crick essentially created a 3D model to discover the double helix of DNA. And spatial reasoning is also used in drug discovery, for example, determining drug efficacy and removing side effects. Some work by myself and David Lubinsky and Camilla Benbow has shown that spatial reasoning predicts performance in STEM fields over and above verbal and mathematical reasoning. Early spatial talent has even been linked to later creativity. It's important for vocational, manufacturing, and visual arts areas. And one thing I'll mention is that creativity today is associated with acting, dancing, artistry, music, and writing. Society often overlooks the creative value of STEM and spatial reasoning. These are two different quotes. One is in 1964 and one is in 2016. And this is just to highlight how spatial reasoning has been studied and researched for many years, but has not really been put into education policy and practice. So the first quote in 1964 by M. Smith, "At the present time, there's a developing educational crisis because of the unsatisfied demand for personnel trained and qualified in all fields in which spatial ability is of fundamental importance. The technical revolution has put a premium on spatial ability at all levels, whether required for tile laying or for topology. A more recent quote by Newman and Winston: employers complain that electricians, pipe fitters, advanced manufacturing machinists, brick masons, and radiology technicians are scarce. More than 600,000 jobs remain open in the manufacturing sector alone. These are jobs that provide a middle-class wage without a traditional four-year college degree. So what's missing in standardized tests? Well, you may have figured out what the answer is here. But if you think about K-12 standardized tests, college admissions, graduate admissions, job selection, throughout the entire process, almost all those tests have mathematical and verbal reasoning components, but they miss spatial reasoning tests. So how does this affect education? Well, students who have spatial reasoning strengths but relative math and verbal reasoning weaknesses, they're disadvantaged throughout the entire education process, whether it's K-12 ed in general, gifted education specifically, college admissions, graduate school admissions. And this lack of spatial measures likely has had a cumulative effect over decades. For example, if you don't identify talent early, you can't really develop it properly. Okay. So now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, David Uttal.
Okay, so John has demonstrated that spatial thinking is important for STEM achievement and attainment. The question is, what can we do about it? And there have been many different attempts to train or educate spatial ability. I conducted with colleagues a systematic meta-analysis of that literature of over 220 studies to see just how malleable spatial thinking is. And the answer is 0.43 standard deviations, which is not huge, but it's certainly enough to make a difference. So it does respond to training. It does, training can involve all kinds of things, like from video games to very formal trainings to life experience, including everything ranging from being a geologist to being a dress designer. These things have all been shown to improve spatial reasoning. Okay, so these are examples of the kinds of things that people have done to try to improve spatial reasoning. Perhaps the best known example is from Cheryl Sorby at University of Cincinnati, where she gives an entire semester-long course to students in the engineering school but who may have lower levels of spatial ability. She shows not only that the spatial ability improves, but also that that improvement transfers to other things, including calculus and some of the engineering courses. But we can also do this informally. There's quite a debate ongoing about the effects of playing video games. The latest meta-analysis that came out suggests that there's a strong and positive effect. Playing video games seems to increase parafoveal attention, what you can attend to without focusing on it very specifically. So if you can take in more information, you certainly can learn more. Okay. The other thing is that there are at least some studies that indicated that this training could last. So if we only make a difference for 1 hour in a psychology lab, that's not relevant to policy because it's gone. We can't do anything with it. However, increasingly we've shown that some of these training interventions, particularly the larger and longer ones, do last enough to make a policy relevant difference. And also there was, for the studies that do include some sort of delay, there was no decline over the testing period. That's probably because those are the most powerful studies that were selected for delay, but still it's an existence proof or proof of concept. Okay. And we also found evidence that training could transfer to other non-trained tasks. Sort of the holy grail in this field, it's a difficult research project but extremely important one, would be to show that spatial ability training transfers to standard STEM classes. As I said, there's some evidence for that. The evidence is still kind of new and we need more and better research, but it's coming. Okay, so what? How much of a difference could we make if we train spatial ability? I said the average effect size was 0.43, which is not enormous, but I also claimed that it was enough to make a difference, and here I want to expand that argument a little bit. So this bell curve here shows two distributions. So the average engineer was 1.51 standard deviations greater than the mean in spatial thinking, which is an enormous advantage. And we're not claiming that we can make everybody 1.51 standard deviations better. However, at a population level, if we trained to 0.43, that would have the effect of shifting the distribution so that, in essence, we double the number of people who had the necessary cognitive abilities to succeed in engineering school, or in the trade fields that John talked about, where there's much more demand than supply in the labor market. So we can make a meaningful policy-relevant difference. There's been some quite rigorous research as well. I mentioned Cheryl Sorby has done studies where they assign people to this class. At first it was optional. Then they made it mandatory for everyone who scored below a little level. This is we don't have to get into the details, a regression discontinuity analysis that strongly suggests that this course really made a difference in calculus and also in the number of women who stayed in the engineering school, because women disproportionately drop out of STEM fields. So the claim is that the spatial intervention did matter. So here are some of our core recommendations for innovations and reforms in education policy. The first is about identification. This is both about talent identification as well as the possibility of intervention for students who might need some support. And the other thing is teacher training and familiarity. We have a paper coming out that's saying that level of spatial ability varies with the level that teachers teach. So, for example, preschool teachers have on average below average spatial skills. It gets better as you get up into high school, particularly for those who are teaching STEM-relevant courses like physics. But this teaching is almost completely ignored and is a point for intervention. Identifying a broader base of low-income talent by including spatial reasoning measures in selection tests. Much of what we know about the effect of spatial intervention goes back to a study that began in 1960 with John and his colleagues have analyzed extensively. And just by a stroke of luck, I think they included 2 spatial abilities tests. And it's so profound that we're still looking at that data. But we need more and better data to analyze to bring things up to date. Spatial ability has largely been ignored, and so all these huge data sets often don't include it. So this is a plea to include spatial ability in any kind of testing. It can be part of personalized learning as we're designing computer-based interventions or self-paced learning. Spatial ability can be part of that. It's fairly easy to include, and we're working on that. It's been a bit of a hard sell, but we're hoping to change that. And finally, intervention in curriculum and program development for spatial talent. Now we're talking about the high end. So there's many programs for gifted children, almost none of which focus on spatial ability. And John and others have argued that we're missing a very important component of talent. Perhaps, as John has written, we might miss the next Einstein because we don't focus on students with high spatial ability. Okay, that concludes our presentation, and we're open for questions now.
Okay.
I think.
Yeah, well, you could go ahead and take a seat, and I'll get us going with a couple of them, and then we'll just carry this on as a conversation. It's really interesting work, and it's an interesting body of research that you both have been into, and I want to help us understand kind of a few things a little bit more deeply. Just before we talk about the policy component, I wanted to get a sense of the population a little bit more. What's the kind of scope and size of population? I mean, just how many people are we talking about? As a percentage of the population who have spatial abilities that we're not picking up on. Is there a way to understand like how many kids in a school classroom might have these abilities that we haven't figured out how to recognize?
That's better for him, I think.
Well, it's a good question, and I'll just say that in terms of abilities, for example, students have profiles of abilities, and so some students, for example, are very high in mathematical and verbal reasoning, but lower in spatial reasoning. The opposite profile, and the student that we're caring about here, is essentially high in spatial, relatively lower in mathematical and verbal. And because of that, they're missing a lot of selection tests, a lot of different aspects in schooling, and so the population is there. I mean, we can do some analysis on the the population representative numbers and take a look at that. That's a good question. But I think the thing to remember is that students with that profile is out there.
Yeah. And when it comes to the abilities of someone who's high, on spatial reasoning abilities, but lower on math and verbal, do they have other sorts of characteristics that are they just as diverse as the population as a whole? They just happen to be high in spatial reasoning, or do they have other types of characteristics, whether it's, I don't know, extroversion or introversion or other things? Do we know?
Do you know?
There's no other way to kind of get a sense of whether or not someone has spatial reasoning abilities other than actually testing for it. Is that right?
Well, the young children's play can suggest it. It's correlated with what they choose to play with. But, that would be a rough assessment. But, yeah, you can look at toy preferences and things like that that are correlated somewhat with it.
Right. And this population is spread more across the socioeconomic spectrum than math and verbal, right? I mean, that's one of the important things I think that you point out in your paper and in research that you've done.
Yeah, so spatial reasoning is less correlated with socioeconomic status than math and verbal reasoning in the population, in those population level correlations. And because of that, it means if you select on spatial, you also pick up more low-income talent.
Yeah, right, okay. And so talk a little bit more just about how these abilities are identified. You got into this a little bit in your presentation, but if we were going to actually start trying to figure out who is high in spatial capability, what sorts of things do you do? What does a spatial abilities test actually look like for those of us who haven't actually taken one?
Well, they often involve imagining transformations to figures. So you have to fold a piece of paper in your mind to match a particular target, or spin things around in your mind. So they require you to think about the relations between parts and wholes, and you choose one of the items that best matches it. There are many, many good spatial tests, and some of them are quite short, and so it could be included without too much additional cost.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. And can you do this online or just through digital tools? So
yes, yeah. It definitely can be done online. Some companies have included it. Yeah, that's increasingly common. Yes.
That's good. So if we were actually going to cultivate spatial ability in the K-12 environment, how would the classroom look differently? I mean, what kind of curriculum changes would we see or expect if we were going to actually do this right?
Well, let me give you an example from the Carnegie Mellon preschool in Pittsburgh. When you walk in there, you notice right away that it's different. They have quilts all over the wall. The children are assigned to particular seating areas using a very simple map. Numbers are communicated visually, spatially. There's lots of work on patterning. I remember a quote, I don't know where it's from, but every good kindergarten teacher knows the value of patterning, two red, one green, and trying to anticipate it. It seems to be very important. Understanding the visual spatial number line is critical to getting number sense. So it's lots of visual spatial communication, lots of spatial games. Even, we're finding like traditional block building is actually quite powerful if you let the child do it, and the thing falls down and you build it up again, and you can learn a great deal that way. They tend to be around, there's a lot of exhibits around building. Early engineering is very popular. So it would be less about, letters and more about spatial relations. There are some schools that are doing this, and it's really quite dramatic. Like quilting is, part of the curriculum.
Yeah. And how do you guys define creativity? Because you mentioned we often associate it with performance, dance, music, these sorts of things, but that this set of abilities is actually important to being creative. But what actually is creativity, and can you make people more creative if you do this right at an earlier age?
Well, do you want to start?
So there's definitions of creativity. What John is, I'm going to turn it over very quickly. What he's been able to do is operationalize creativity in terms of things like patents and application. So you have success in fields, and Then you have creative success, and so you can imagine being very good at a field but not very creative. And John has done some work on the relation of spatial ability. So there are many, many different definitions of creative. John's been able to find a tractable way to study it, so that's my intro for you.
Thanks.
Okay.
So I'd say, first of all, making an advance in the STEM field, something that's practical, useful, but also novel and new, is actually a creative act. Mm-hmm. And so I think if we can view the STEM fields as that, I think that's important. In terms of spatial ability and reasoning, it's kind of a necessary but insufficient condition for creativity. So, for example, we've shown that spatial ability predicts STEM performance, innovations, patents, and being in STEM occupations, but also in the visual arts. So it's kind of like this thing where there's a population of students who have the ability to create, but are just not really supported by the school systems. Mm-hmm. And so we could do a lot to help them, I think.
So when you say a little bit more about that people with spatial abilities, that having spatial abilities predicts patents, you mentioned, for instance. Okay. How did you find that, or how do you know that?
So in more than one longitudinal study, we took a look at their spatial reasoning ability at a younger age, and then followed them up many years later, and figured out that they actually earned patents at a greater rate if they had higher spatial ability.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
But I also want to stress that creativity happens in trades as well. Many of you are familiar with the maker movement, where we allow both children and adults to use their hands to make things with maker spaces. They're all over the place, hacker space. And a creative plumber or a creative electrician can solve problems that come up. It's not just a routinized thing. He or she enjoys anticipating the problems and finding solutions to them. So we see creativity at all levels of employment.
Very interesting. So I'm not going to presume that you're historians within your field, but I have to ask, if we have a body of literature that shows that people that possess high math and verbal skills, that predicts occupational and educational success, but then there's also this literature that shows that people with spatial abilities, that also predicts occupational and educational success. So how did we get to where we are? Why math and verbal? Why have they been privileged within our educational institutions now for so long, both in the K-12 environment and the way that we actually screen people or admit them to college? How did we get here?
Well, I think it's been devalued as an intellectual skill. So there's been lots of placement on the basis of spatial tests. For example, in World War II, there were many different batteries that were used to place people as they entered the Army to figure out what job they would do best. And spatial abilities tests played a critical role for that. But it hasn't been seen as something that's part of being an educated person so much. So historically, I actually think it goes all the way back to the printing press, where being learned meant being literate, and these other things are, it's separating you out from the trades, and we kind of want to bring that back together again. So the guilds and high spatial things were important, but not the final goal of education, and for many people, they could be.
Mm-hmm. The consequences for higher education, I just want to ask you about that. Too, you say in your presentation in the paper that you've written for AEI that this should certainly factor into the way that we do testing for college, so SAT, ACT. Does this have implications for college curriculum itself? Like
Yes.
So let's say we screen for it now with ACT and SAT, and we make that a part of the test. Once you get to college, how does the college curricular environment change if we're doing it right?
Okay, I think I can take that. First of all, I want to compliment the American Dental Association, because getting into dentistry school requires spatial ability tests. To my knowledge, that's the only profession that actually formally tests that, including architecture does not. But so, yay to the dentist. But now, in terms of answering your question, how will we bring this into the college curriculum? How will it affect the college curriculum? There's several ways. One is about the tools that people need to understand spatial reasoning. So one very particular tool that's one of the top 5 job growth industries is geospatial reasoning technologies, GIS, geospatial information systems. So when you go on Facebook and you see all these different maps, constant, I never know whether it's actually there or it's just because I'm interested in maps and that's all I see, but you get a lot of maps on Facebook and in the news. Those are all made by GIS technologies. As an election's coming up, we realize just how important geography is for understanding elections and how and why people vote. That's just one of many, many examples, or transportation developments, whatever that might be. So one of the things I would recommend is that we teach students some of the tools. One good example just is the University of Redlands. It's a liberal arts college in Redlands, California, which just so happens to be where the main GIS software is made. But they have established an entire geospatial curriculum. They even use geospatial technologies to teach humanities courses. Like if you think about history, it's very much about patterns and movements and influences. So, at an extreme example, it would pervade the curriculum. Maybe that's a pipe dream for everything. And a less extreme example, we need to keep in mind that it's a challenge for people. So, for example, I'm fond of saying that organic chemistry is the greatest source of psychology majors because they drop out of this. I think psychology is a STEM field, but they drop out of chemistry and come over to the psychology department. This has happened 7 times in my career. Someone's knocked on my door and said, I've realized I don't want to be a scientist, I want to be a psychologist, and that just stabs me in the heart, but we can explain. When you're teaching, be mindful of the fact that this isn't easy for everyone. So professors of chemistry, it is easy for them, and they've been doing it for decades. And there are formal systems of representing molecules, the three-dimensional things, that are literally second nature to them. But just be mindful of the fact that about 1/3 of the people may be struggling, and that it's not that hard to do something about it. And finally, I think an effective curriculum has connections amongst different classes, breaks down some of the siloing. There's lots of debates about how much we actually learn in college, and does it affect our critical thinking or not? And I think this is one of those kind of cross-cutting discipline things that could help connect things of how we represent and model information. So I really think we're experiencing a geospatial revolution right now, and students can take advantage of that.
Great. I'm going to turn it over to our audience for questions here in just a minute. And while you get your thoughts together for that, I just wanted to ask one additional question, and that is, what should parents know? What can parents do? We've been talking about the educational environment. That's obviously the main reason that we're interested in this, is how should education policy factor these important findings into our deliberations about policy. But just at the level of the household, for especially parents that have gone to college, who understand the value of education, higher income households, parents spend a lot of time now getting their kids ready in the math and verbal categories, right? We're reading to our kids, and we've heard about how they need to know so many words, and we do all this stuff with them. Parents don't know, most of us, I would say, don't know anything about this field. But it sounds like it would be important to understand it as a parent.
And in fact, I think some of the very best research coming out is sort of in the age of like 5 and then the transition into elementary school, where they have shown that parental behaviors at home actually made a difference in like basic number sense in 1st and 2nd grade. And talk about spatial relationships, play spatial games. These things actually have been shown to positively correlate. As close to an experiment as we could get in the real world really seems to show that playing spatial games really does matter. It becomes a topic of focus. If we're arranging this everywhere, arranging the silverware on the table, what's it going to look like when we do it for Uncle John? Or just getting them to think about things. The other thing is when you're out, Chicago's a wonderful place to do this, but every city is, pointing out construction, asking them how these buildings relate to each other, how were they made, just getting them to think about the engineering process. People just take all these things for granted, but when you see a construction site, it's actually an opportunity for learning. So it does make a difference, and I can say that with more confidence, actually, than I can for some of the research in college, because it's just really good, large-scale, longitudinal studies have really shown we can make a difference. And the spatial apps are coming. You're absolutely right that most of them focus on verbal, but there's quite a few on the App Store, and that's one of the research things we're trying to do. One of the conflicts there is that apps are inherently two-dimensional. You can represent 3 dimensions. There's a debate about whether it's really important to actually play with physical things. So some people who are very much interested in spatial things are worried about it being all on a screen. So you can think about that debate, but you can make a big difference with relatively little effort.
Yeah, very good. Okay, well, let's turn it over to you to see if we have any questions. If you do, just raise your hand and Mike will come to you. Okay, we have a few. Let's just start back here and work our way up to the front.
Yes, good morning. What a fascinating panel and topic. John Bird with the National Society of Professional Surveyors, NSPS, and want to compliment you on your geospatial shout out. We represent the land surveyors, mappers, GIS, geospatial professionals, and the going back to the nation's founding, one of the big-time surveyors is George Washington, of course, so that could be a good addition to your PowerPoint. But workforce development is a big issue, if not the topic in the surveying community. The average age of a surveyor is 58. There's simply not enough students, quite frankly, coming through the system, replace the soon-to-be retiring wave. And to the extent that outside of the Redlands example that you brought up, how do you see the geospatial community, geospatial skills in your research and your different evaluations? How can that be incentivized? How can that be applied to help address the workforce issue, specifically children at a much younger age than the Redlands College example?
Well, we do have a research program that's trying to do that in career and technical education, CTE, in the Chicago public schools. You're absolutely right. So these are the supply of jobs greatly exceeds the demand right now, or the availability of talent. And talent can be developed over the course of perhaps 2 years or so. It doesn't take 8 or 10 years. I don't mean to diminish the quality of the education. But in the CTE now, we're trying to say, so Chicago has a dozen CTE fields, justice and law enforcement, marketing, agriculture, allied health professions, many of these. And what we're trying to do is to sort of say, many of these fields have a geospatial component. So we're trying to use GIS in CTE courses. It's just begun with the help of it's actually funded by the iTest program, which is funded by the H-2B visa program. So part of that money is that, yes, we'll let there be visas for foreigners and expertise fields, but we want to put a little bit of money away to develop American expertise. And so, fortunately, we have a small amount of that, and we're trying to do it. So, the other thing is, this is generally true of most students don't know about these things. So I encourage you to reach out to middle school and high school things, because they simply do not know. I cannot recall a student saying, I want to be a surveyor, even though it could be a great occupation. And awareness is a big part of the problem. I think economically we're right at the cusp of a change. And one example of that is the Chicago public schools and the Chicago community colleges, the city colleges, recognize this. So when they're starting to worry that they're getting behind on this, that's a good sign. So there's some cutting edge school districts, and there's some school districts that are worried that they're getting behind. So I think it's happening, but time will tell. I feel that we might be getting that upswing.
Very good. I think we had another question back here. Yeah.
Yeah, hello. My name is Jutta Mary Leinen. I'm a mental health nurse from Ontario, Canada. And your talk made me think about my students. So past years, I've got increasing numbers of kindergartens, grade 1, grade 2s, for behavioral issues, ADHD, attention issue. So I was wondering if you have come across that some of these children who are gifted in spatial awareness and are put in traditional math and language class, they feel frustrated and feel that they are inadequate, and actually they are very gifted. So I wonder if you have come across the behavioral issues, if these kids would have been tested, would they have come up across with the high spatial awareness and gift?
I'm not aware of research on that specifically, but I would say that, students with spatial strengths and relative verbal and mathematical weaknesses, it's an incompatibility between their particular profile and the way that school is conducted, and also the abilities that are valued. And so whenever that incompatibility occurs, I think that there is frustration.
Yeah.
And so it's something to be definitely aware of. Another thing I wanted to point out earlier is that, to address one of your questions, Ryan, is that David Lohman wrote a great paper called Spatially Gifted, Verbally Inconvenienced. And so spatially gifted students don't always speak out. And I think that's also a reason why they're underappreciated for many, many years.
That's really important.
Active engagement. So these might be the students who like to, build things more than they like to sit behind a desk. And the structure of the curriculum may not allow that as much as it did before. They do tend to be disproportionately male, although there's plenty of girls too. But so boys get labeled with behavior problems more than girls do, and part of that might be different play styles that are harder to manage in the classroom and things like that. So it's engagement and play. You see kids with ADHD focused on building things, so they can focus. They just don't want to focus on what the teacher wants them to focus on.
Very good. I think we had a couple of other questions here too. Let's go up here and then we can go back to the back of the room.
You were talking about those students or adults who are not particularly good necessarily at verbal and math, but are good at spatial. But I'm wondering, what is the overall correlation among the three areas?
That's question. It's a pretty high correlation. Yeah. There is an overall correlation between the three because there is general ability. And so all these different specific abilities are all highly correlated. Yeah.
But there's also...
But they're also separate.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's...
Yeah.
Yes, they're correlated. It's also the first split in a hierarchical model of intelligence. The first division is usually between spatial and verbal. So given that all intellectual abilities are related, yes, you're absolutely right. But given that they're different, then this is one of the greatest differences.
We've also shown incremental prediction of spatial over and above math and verbal reasoning on long-term outcomes, which is why we're trying to recommend that talent selection on this specific ability could be useful.
Very good. Okay. We have a question. Yeah, let's go up here and then back here to the middle.
Good morning. Eileen Murphy, and I'm an instructional superintendent with District of Columbia Public Schools. So I have multiple questions. One is very broad in terms of what you would recommend school districts such as ours move forward with areas of spatial relations, and then also resources for games children can play that you mentioned. And also we have a lot of online programs, some of which I don't know if you're familiar with ST Math. And I wanted your opinion about that because that has a lot of spatial training components. Did I ask too much?
No, I'm just trying to remember. Why don't you start?
No, you go for it.
Well, let me does your district have a GIS course? Well, fortunately, a lot of our work started in the Northern Virginia area. It's actually Arlington is part of it. And the professor is the Dean of Engineering at James Madison University is actually the one who started this whole thing. So my first recommendation, now this is only going to get to the, 11th, 12th grade, but is consider a GIS course. People who, you're going to college, it's great. You're going into a trade, that's great. You're going into the military, it can definitely affect what jobs you do in the military. So that would be my first recommendation. And I can hook you up with This is actually an excellent area to do that because it's going on in Loudoun County and Arlington County. The online things, I mean, certainly, I think it's a very rich area that we have yet to sufficiently explore. And one of the problems I've had with that is it tends to be very proprietary and it's sort of hard to get the data. And so some openness of the data would really help us because there's enormous things. Another example that I thought about for a while is University of Phoenix, which is, thousands and hundreds of thousands of students, I think, and there's some spatial ability things in there, but getting that kind of data is generally next to impossible. There's ethical reasons, but there's also proprietary reasons. So I encourage you to adopt some things. I encourage you to do it in partnership with some researchers. There's people at Georgetown doing this, people at James Madison doing it, and Chicago's not that far either. So start now. You had a third question. Yeah. Am I going to come up with the name? Okay. This may seem incredibly old-fashioned. I know of nothing better than block play. That's partly because that's what the research has been done on. But the thing about block play is, okay, let's consider old Legos and new Legos. So I like old Legos. I'm less enamored with new Legos. And by that I mean, so when I was too old, but simple blocks, simple Legos, where you had to design it yourself and experience taking things apart, re-putting together, think about a whole and how the parts constitute it. Those things were really important for thinking about spatial relations. In contrast, making a big, exactly, is there anybody from Lego in here? I got to be careful. Like making a big spaceship, you buy the Lego set to build a spaceship. And there's actually, I think I could even say this from a research grounding, that does not engage kids in the same way that we would want to, because it's all focused on making that one thing. It's also, some of it's just copying from the thing. So the Maker Faire people, do you all know about the Maker movement? Yeah. So those folks very strongly emphasize the creative aspect of it, that making, how much guidance you should supply is a very important question. It's not as much as like build this thing, right? Make this Lego thing. It's not going to help as much as more open-ended. Now, you can go too far the other direction. You need some guidance, some suggestions, so they can say, look what this kid built, and how do you think he or she did it? But don't say, let's make this robot, would be my recommendation.
Very good. We had a question right here.
Mine's actually more of a comment. My name is Rebecca Clem. I actually am a PhD statistician, but I have an organization called Numbers Alive. And I would encourage all of you, if you're interested, to work with me. I have patents and I have spatial reasoning that I bring into math. Many of them don't like it because they're not spatial thinkers, a lot of the low-level teachers, and I go all the way to PhD. But I have won trophies on the way of bringing 2D and 3D into pre-kindergarten, up into elementary, and all the way to a new conjecture in geometry. Those skills are critical, and I've had a lot of teachers who I've worked with who are using them. I'm right here in Washington, D.C., that have said, I have students, because I work with teachers, I have students who were not very good in classical mathematics. I work with a lot of them. They're very gifted in many ways, and I give them my puzzles with both concave and convex polygons, and they can solve them better than the teachers. So I've seen the teachers say, you've transformed my understanding of the way people learn. But I think we need to bring all three of them together, and I do. When I teach the lessons that I create and the activities I do, we bring verbal, math, and spatial all together as the center part of the Venn diagram, because it is really the intersection of them all that is the growth for giving people the capabilities to do everything they want. But anyway, I'm happy to work with anyone. I've taught university, I've taught preschool, and I am here in Washington, and I love to have people try out the things that I invent, and students help me invent 2D, 3D, and linear projects.
Do we get the attendee list? So I just want to make sure we can get in contact afterwards.
Yeah, we can do that. And where can we go to learn about the tools you've created? Is there?
Numbersalive.org is my website.
Say it again.
Numbersalive.org. And the numbers are the teachers for the young children, so that there's no denigration of an adult, and I am the numbers lady. You've probably seen me at many maker fairs. I have patents in the trademark shows. They have me there at the Smithsonian. Where I'm an art collector in 3D and 2D, and we use all of those things in teaching math all the way through. But the math teachers are some of the hardest to crack because most of them are not so spatial, and they have to learn, and I work with them.
If American Psychological Association ever publishes our paper, it's been sitting in press for like 18 months. It's about teachers at different levels. And preschool teachers are low spatial in general. And as I said, it gets better, but it really, maybe it's the students that will guide it. You also said something I think is really important, maybe that we sort of gave a false impression, like, the brain works together. It's not like just we have a system, and so this doesn't mean that verbal is unimportant. We're not substituting spatial for verbal, but we're allowing you to do things with your hands, but you will need verbal to describe what you've done and things like that. So it's not, it's a tilt of skills and trying to reach people with a different configuration, but not saying you can't do verbal or you're not, yeah.
Very good.
No, I didn't mean, I thought I might have implied that, yeah.
Teach reading, and then you teach math, because the world is like that. And I am all into bringing them all together. We have number 2 talk about the difference between double, twin, pair.
Yep.
PEAR. Where do you have these things verbally and where the words fit in?
Yeah, patterning is verbal.
Very much patterning. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. It's fascinating. I know we have a question back over here. Yeah.
Hi there, I'm Mike Hurwitz at the College Board. This is really, really fascinating information. And so the one question I had actually was hinted at over here. I was interested in the correlations between the 3 components, but I'm also interested in, you talked about that movement of ability as 0.42 standard deviations. How much training is needed to get that movement? And what would similar training in mathematics and verbal reasoning, how much would they sort of shift the distributions? So I guess, in other words, it's like how malleable is spatial reasoning relative to verbal and math?
Why don't you do the first one about the correlations, and I'll do the malleability question.
I don't have the correlation off the top of my head, but I know it's in some of the work that we've done, so I'm going to pass it off to David.
Okay.
Yep.
A little bit more about the point. That is a very conservative estimate because it puts everything together. If you were asking me for an intervention program, I would not use the average one. I would use some of the excellent ones, which would be much higher. In terms of the malleability, like at an empirical level, it's going to be more malleable, but that's because we do so much with math and verbal that some of that malleability has already happened before we test them. And the other reason we did the malleability of spatial cognition is so often people think it's like a fixed innate skill, and whether it is or not, there's a margin on there where you can make a substantial difference. So I think I can say that intervention studies on the average are less than around 0.3, and so we're substantially higher than that, partly because it's new. So when you start educating people something they don't know very well, you can make a big difference at the beginning. And that may have already happened in math and hasn't happened at the verbal.
See, there was another hand. Yeah, back here in the corner.
That's bright.
Curtis Pike, George Washington University. In terms of addressing teachers, I'm hearing a lot about outcomes, but I'm not hearing a lot about the tools to give teachers to think about where spatial ability kind of fits in the model of learning. And to date, I don't think we think much or get much from our psychologists about a model of learning that would really support the integration and recognize the contribution of spatial skills to learning. Do you have comments on that or thoughts about, what should we tell teachers about how kids learn to get this front and center?
Well, professional development is absolutely critical part of this, and I think you're absolutely right. The teacher education is a lagging indicator, if you will, of the effects that we're having. I do think it's having some effects, but it's slow. There are people working on curricula, both for in-service teachers as well as for pre-service teachers. Some of that's going on at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore to have. All teachers have professional development days, and there are spatial options that they can take. But for the whole nation, it's quite small and trivial. I think that's a very important next step that we need to do. I can give you some shining, successful examples, but that's it, and it's not at the population level, so you're absolutely right.
Good. Do we have another? Yeah, we have a question back here.
Hello, thank you for your talk. A quick question since we're here in DC and regarding policy. The recent federal K-12 bill kind of changed the main domains. It allowed states to have more than just math and verbal as a focus. I'm curious, when you go out to the states and talk to policymakers, or even school districts, like I used to work at DC schools myself, what is their response to maybe include this as part of it so that pie can be all three pieces that I know you put out there, Dr. Wai? Thank you.
He addressed you by name.
I know Bill, so.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, David.
Okay.
Go for it.
Really?
No, I know.
Well,
Bill.
my first surprise when I talk to teachers is there's two responses. Wow, and where are we going to fit it? So we like to think of this as not a separate course, but as a way of teaching science, math, engineering, and possibly some humanities as well, as a practice. Like writing is a practice, mapping, yeah, that's pie in the sky, but we get up there. So CTE teachers definitely see it as important. Traditional math and physics, they recognize the importance of it, but again, they have very set curricula now that they have trouble violating. But I think what you talked about with the new bill, giving us a chance to have some more flexibility, maybe we'll get that response a little less if states or localities are allowed to have a little bit more choice as to what the curriculum. In theory, they have complete choice, but because of all the testing and funding issues, they have certain things they have to meet. And I find in talking to schools, disappointingly little room for flexibility and creativity. So maybe that will help.
So we've got another question back here.
Hi there, Nathaniel Urban. I work at the American Council of Trustees and Alumni on higher education policy, specifically assessing general education requirements. If spatial reasoning was incorporated in general education requirements at the college level, could spatially gifted students still be discovered early on like that?
So, well, let's see if I'm getting at your question, but I think one thing that happens in higher education and admissions is that students with the higher spatial profile, lower math verbal profile, because of the SAT, ACT, and all the admissions tests, and throughout K-12 too, not just those tests, they're disadvantaged throughout the selection process. So I think that's why including a spatial measure in all these different tests would be important. Does that address your question? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now this is a really important. This is relating to local Northwestern policy, and I'm sure you'll know this debate. In some universities, you are admitted to the university and not admitted to a college. That is not true at my university. If you want to be in the engineering school, that's a separate admission. If you want to be in a journalism school, that's a separate admission. Our board of trustees and president want to make it an admission to the university, like Yale. So. In general, that would help to give us a chance to identify people. So, okay. One of the things we've studied is what we call STEM joining. There's so much work on leaving STEM, STEM dropout, lack of persistence. There's a small but important group of people who go from, it actually happens, from psychology to STEM. And that group is barely understood and not nurtured at all. If we don't force people into colleges immediately, then we might give them more choice. Now, my School of Engineering colleagues say this is absolutely impossible. The curriculum is very set. We have to get going right away. And what you're going to end up doing is making people stay for 5 expensive years instead of 4 expensive years. So there are downsides to this, definitely. But I'm sure that's a debate that you face. What are you admitted into? And if that admission decision is not super restrictive, then you'd have more chance of identifying, nurturing, and actually developing these students.
Well, we've got a lot to think about and it looks like to do on the basis of this research, and a lot of opportunities for reform and exploration. So, David, Jonathan, it's a fascinating topic. Thank you for being here. And I'm sure we have a few minutes just informally to mingle if you have a few follow-up questions. I wish everybody a good rest of the day and a good rest of the week.
If somebody could get my bag, I have my cards in that bag.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So